David Williams never thought he'd be the kind of person who got excited about yard work. Growing up in a small apartment with his grandmother, he'd dreamed of having his own house with a real yard where he could plant things and watch them grow. When he finally saved enough money for a down payment at age 32, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with that little piece of land that would finally be his. The house he bought in Riverside Gardens wasn't anything fancy. It was a simple 2-story home with white siding and blue shutters, sitting on a quarter-acre lot at the end of Maple Street. The previous owners had let the landscaping go, and the front yard was mostly dirt and weeds. But David saw potential where others saw problems. "This is going to be perfect," he told his neighbor Jerry, an older man who lived next door and had watched 3 different families come and go from David's house over the years. Jerry had grown skeptical of new neighbors, but something about David's enthusiasm made him smile. David worked as an engineer at the local water treatment plant, a job that required attention to detail and patience. These same qualities served him well as he began transforming his front yard. Every weekend you could find him outside, working with his hands in the soil, carefully measuring distances and planning where each plant would go. His masterpiece was going to be the hedge along the front border of his property. David had researched different types of shrubs for months, reading gardening forums late into the night and visiting every nursery within 50 miles. He finally settled on privet shrubs, known for their dense growth and ability to create a beautiful living fence. "You sure you want to plant all those little things?" Jerry asked one Saturday morning, watching David carefully space out dozens of small privet plants along his property line. "They don't look like much now." David wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned. "Just wait a couple years. These are going to be amazing. He wasn't wrong." David treated those plants like they were his children. Every morning before work, he'd walk along the hedge line, checking for signs of disease or damage. He watered them by hand, even though it would have been easier to use sprinklers. He researched the best fertilizers and applied them exactly according to schedule. When winter came, he carefully wrapped the more delicate plants to protect them from frost. The other neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Chen from across the street would often pause during her evening walks to admire David's progress. The Martinez family next door started asking for gardening advice. Even the teenagers who lived 2 houses down stopped throwing their trash in his direction after they saw how much care he put into his yard. "That boy's got magic hands," Mrs. Chen told her husband one evening as they watched David pruning his hedge with the precision of a surgeon. "Everything he touches just grows better." By the second year, the hedge had filled in beautifully. What started as scraggly little plants had grown into a lush green wall that stood about 4 feet tall and ran the entire length of David's front property line. It provided perfect privacy from the street while still looking elegant and welcoming. The hedge had become the talk of the neighborhood. David had done his homework when planning the hedge. He'd pulled out the official property survey from when he bought the house and made sure every single plant was at least 2 feet inside his property line. He checked the HOA rules twice, and there was nothing that prohibited hedges or set height limits for landscaping. Several other houses in the neighborhood had similar or even larger hedges, some dating back 20 years or more. But David's hedge was special. While the others in the neighborhood were overgrown or patchy, his was perfectly manicured. Every shrub was exactly the same height. The edges were straight as a ruler. The spacing was so precise it looked like something from a high-end landscaping magazine. "How do you get it so perfect?" asked Tom from down the street. Tom had been struggling with his own landscaping project and was clearly frustrated. David chuckled and pulled out a small notebook from his back pocket. "I keep track of everything. When I water, when I fertilize, when I trim, I measure the height every month to make sure it's growing evenly. If one section starts getting taller than the others, I know exactly what to do." The hedge wasn't just beautiful. It was functional too. It blocked the view of David's front windows from the busy street, giving him privacy without making his home feel closed off. It also helped reduce noise from traffic and created a sense of boundaries that made the whole front yard feel more intimate and peaceful. David had turned the area behind the hedge into a small garden paradise. He'd planted flower beds with rotating seasonal blooms, installed a small fountain that attracted birds, and even built a wooden bench where he could sit and enjoy his morning coffee. Neighbors would often comment that just walking past his house made them feel calmer. The hedge had also increased his property value. When the house next door went up for sale, The real estate agent specifically mentioned David's landscaping as a selling point for the neighborhood. "You've got the best-looking yard on the street," the agent told David. "It's making everyone's property worth more." David took pride in being a good neighbor in other ways, too. He shoveled snow from the sidewalks of elderly residents in winter. He helped carry groceries for Mrs. Chen when her arthritis was acting up. When the Martinez family went on vacation, he watered their plants and collected their mail. During the big storm last spring, he spent 3 days helping neighbors clean up fallen branches and debris. "We're lucky to have him on our street," Jerry told his wife one evening. "Haven't had a neighbor like him in years. Really cares about the place." The homeowners association had been pretty quiet since David moved in. They sent out their monthly newsletters with reminders about trash pickup days and announcements about the annual neighborhood barbecue, but there hadn't been any drama or complaints. The previous HOA president had been an easygoing retired teacher who believed in letting people live their lives as long as they weren't bothering anyone. David had even volunteered to help with the neighborhood barbecue planning committee and had donated plants from his garden for the community flower beds at the entrance to Riverside Gardens. He was exactly the kind of resident that HOAs dream about having, someone who improved the neighborhood through their own initiative and helped bring the community together. As he stood in his front yard one sunny afternoon in late spring, admiring how the hedge had grown thick and green after the winter, David felt a deep satisfaction. This was what he'd dreamed of as a kid, a place that was truly his, where he could create something beautiful and lasting. He had no idea that his peaceful little paradise was about to be threatened by forces he never saw coming. The trouble started 3 months after the annual HOA election, when Patricia Hoffman was voted in as the new president. Patricia was a 62-year-old retired real estate agent who had moved to Riverside Gardens 5 years earlier after her divorce. She had been campaigning for HOA president for 2 years, promising to restore order and property values to the neighborhood. Most residents didn't pay much attention to HOA politics. They figured as long as someone was willing to do the paperwork and organize the occasional community event, it didn't matter much who was in charge. This turned out to be a big mistake. Patricia had very different ideas about how a neighborhood should look, compared to the laid-back approach of the previous president. She believed that strict rules and consistent enforcement were the keys to maintaining a quality community. Within her first month in office, she had already sent out violation notices to 7 different households for infractions ranging from inappropriate mailbox colors to excessive garden decorations. David first encountered Patricia on a Tuesday evening in June. He was outside watering his hedge when a woman he didn't recognize walked up his driveway with a clipboard and measuring tape. "Excuse me," Patricia said, not bothering with introductions. "I'm here to inspect your hedge for compliance violations." David turned off his hose and looked at her with confusion. "I'm sorry, compliance with what? And who are you?" "Patricia Hoffman, HOA president. Your hedge appears to be in violation of our sightline regulations." She pulled out her measuring tape and began measuring the height of his hedge without asking permission. "Sightline regulations?" David asked. "I've read the HOA rules cover to cover. There's nothing about sightlines or hedge height restrictions." Patricia didn't look up from her measuring tape. 4 feet 2 inches? That's definitely a violation. The rules clearly state that landscaping cannot obstruct sightlines for vehicular traffic. David felt his heart rate starting to increase. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my hedge is entirely on my own property, and there are no sightline issues. Cars can see perfectly fine at the corner, and my hedge isn't even near the corner anyway." "Are you arguing with me?" Patricia finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Because I can assure you that arguing with HOA enforcement will only make this situation worse for you." David took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm not arguing. I'm just trying to understand what rule I'm supposedly breaking. Could you show me the specific regulation you're referring to?" Patricia made some notes on her clipboard. "I'll be sending you a formal violation notice within the next few days. You'll have 14 days to remedy the situation or face daily fines." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David standing in his driveway completely bewildered. He'd never had any problems with neighbors or the HOA before. His hedge was beautiful, well-maintained, and identical to several others in the neighborhood that had been there for years. That evening, David called Jerry to ask if he knew anything about these supposed sightline rules. Sightlines? Jerry laughed. David, I've lived here for 15 years and I've never heard of any sightline rules. Patricia's just making stuff up. She's been going around the neighborhood with that clipboard of hers looking for things to complain about. But she's the HOA president, David said. Doesn't that mean she knows the rules? Being president doesn't make you right, Jerry replied. Trust me, kid. This woman's trouble. She tried to tell the Martinez family they couldn't have their kids' bicycles in their own driveway. Said it was unsightly clutter. 3 days later, David found the promised violation notice taped to his front door. The letter was full of official-sounding language and demanded the immediate removal of non-compliant landscaping obstructing vehicular sightlines. It referenced a regulation number that, when David looked it up, turned out to be about holiday decorations, not hedges. David decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address this issue directly. The meeting was held in the community center conference room, and about 20 residents were in attendance. Patricia sat at the front table with 2 other board members, looking very official with her stack of papers and gavel. When the meeting opened for resident comments, David stood up and politely explained his situation. He brought photos of his hedge, his property survey showing that everything was well within his property lines, and examples of similar hedges throughout the neighborhood that had never been cited for violations. Mrs. Hoffman, David said, I'm hoping we can clear up this misunderstanding. I can't find any regulation that my hedge violates, and I'd appreciate clarification on exactly what needs to be changed. Patricia barely looked at his documentation. Mr. Williams, the board has determined that your hedge constitutes a safety violation. The decision is final. But what about due process? David asked. Shouldn't there be some kind of hearing or appeal process? This is not a court of law, Patricia replied curtly. The HOA board has the authority to make decisions about community safety, and we've made ours. David noticed that several other residents were shaking their heads and whispering among themselves. After the meeting, 3 different neighbors approached him to express their support and share their own stories about Patricia's increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. She's power-hungry, said Linda from Oak Street. Last month she told me I couldn't plant roses in my front yard because they weren't on some approved plant list that doesn't even exist. Over the next few weeks, Patricia's harassment escalated. She would drive slowly past David's house multiple times a day, sometimes stopping to take pictures of his hedge from different angles.
She began leaving notes on his door at random times,
with messages like, final warning, compliance required, and daily fines begin Monday. David tried calling Patricia directly to discuss the issue, but she either wouldn't answer or would immediately hang up when she realized who was calling. He requested copies of the specific regulations he was supposedly violating, but Patricia claimed those documents were confidential board materials. The situation reached a breaking point when Patricia started showing up at David's house while he was at work, measuring his hedge and leaving increasingly threatening notes. His neighbor Mrs. Chen called him at work one day to let him know that Patricia had been on his property with some kind of surveying equipment. David, honey, Mrs. Chen said, I don't think she's supposed to be on your property like that. It doesn't seem right. That evening, David found Patricia's latest note, which claimed he now owed $350 in accumulated daily fines and warned that enforcement action would be taken if payment wasn't received within 48 hours. David had reached his limit. He contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, hoping to get some guidance on his rights. The lawyer, Robert Chen, reviewed David's documentation and Patricia's violation notices. This is clearly harassment, Robert told David during their consultation. She's citing non-existent regulations and imposing fines without following proper procedures. You have grounds for legal action against both her personally and the HOA. I don't want to sue anyone, David said. I just want to be left alone to enjoy my property in peace. I understand, Robert replied, but sometimes legal action is the only way to stop this kind of behavior. In the meantime, I'd recommend documenting everything. Take photos, keep all her notes, and maybe set up a security camera to record any future incidents. David left the lawyer's office feeling more frustrated than ever. All he'd wanted was to have a nice yard and be a good neighbor. Now he was being forced to consider legal action just to protect his right to keep plants on his own property. That weekend, David was outside trimming his hedge when Jerry walked over with a concerned expression. "David, I hate to tell you this," Jerry said, "but I overheard Patricia talking to some landscaping crew yesterday. She was asking about costs for removing hedges." David's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I think she's planning something," Jerry said. "You might want to be extra careful. This woman's not playing around." David looked at his beautiful hedge, the result of 3 years of careful work and love. He couldn't believe that someone would actually try to destroy it. But given Patricia's behavior so far, he was starting to realize that nothing was off the table. That night, David installed a security camera system, hoping he'd never need to use the footage. David had a particularly long day at work on Thursday. The water treatment plant had been dealing with equipment failures all week, and he'd stayed late to help troubleshoot a filtration system that kept shutting down. By the time he left the office, it was already getting dark, and he was looking forward to getting home, maybe grilling a burger, and relaxing in his backyard. As he turned onto Maple Street, something looked wrong. David slowed his car, trying to figure out what was different about his usually familiar neighborhood. Then he saw his house and his heart nearly stopped. His hedge was gone. Completely gone. Where his beautiful, carefully maintained privet hedge had stood that morning, there was now just bare dirt and scattered debris. 3 years of work, 3 years of careful nurturing, reduced to nothing but wood chips and broken branches scattered across his front lawn like the remains of a massacre. David sat in his driveway for a full minute, unable to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare. But as he walked toward what used to be his hedge, the reality hit him like a physical blow. Every single plant had been cut down to ground level. The stumps had been ground out, leaving raw patches of disturbed earth. Even the neat edging stones he'd installed to define the hedge line had been pulled up and thrown aside. It wasn't just removal, it was destruction so complete it looked almost vindictive. "David," Jerry's voice came from the next yard over. His elderly neighbor was hurrying toward him as fast as his arthritic legs would carry him. "David, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop them, but they said they had authorization." "Who?" David's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Who did this?" "Some landscaping crew," Jerry said, his face flushed with anger. "They showed up around noon with a truck and a wood chipper. That Patricia woman was here directing them, taking pictures, real pleased with herself." David felt like he might throw up. "Taking pictures?" "Yeah, like she was documenting some kind of victory." "David, this is criminal. They destroyed your property. You need to call the police." Before David could respond, he heard footsteps on his driveway. He turned to see Patricia walking toward them with a satisfied smile on her face and an envelope in her hand. "Mr. Williams," she said cheerfully, as if she hadn't just destroyed thousands of dollars worth of landscaping. "I trust you can see that the compliance issue has been resolved." "You destroyed my hedge," David said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I removed a safety hazard that was in violation of community standards," Patricia replied calmly. "As is my authority as HOA president." She held out the envelope. "This is your invoice for the removal service. $800 due within 30 days. David stared at the envelope like it was a snake. "You want me to pay you for destroying my property?" "I want you to pay for the emergency compliance action that your violations made necessary," Patricia said. "The crew was very efficient. They said your hedge was one of the thickest they'd ever had to remove." Jerry stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Patricia, this is outrageous. You can't just destroy someone's property and then charge them for it." "Mind your own business, Jerry," Patricia snapped. "Unless you want me to start looking more closely at your property for violations." "Are you threatening me?" Jerry asked. "I'm reminding you that everyone in this neighborhood needs to follow the rules," Patricia replied. David here learned that lesson today. David was still staring at the devastation where his hedge used to be. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years I spent growing those plants. "Well, maybe next time you'll check with the HOA before making major landscaping decisions," Patricia said. "Good evening, gentlemen." She turned and walked away, leaving David and Jerry standing in the growing darkness among the scattered remains of what had been David's pride and joy. "This is insane," Jerry said. "She can't do this. There have to be laws against this kind of thing." David walked over to where his hedge used to be and knelt down, picking up a piece of branch that still had green leaves attached. His hands were shaking. "I should have done more to protect them." David, this isn't your fault, Jerry said firmly. You followed every rule, you did everything right. This woman is a bully and a criminal. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept walking to his front window and looking out at the empty space where his hedge used to be. Every time he saw it, he felt the same sick feeling in his stomach. He'd put so much love and care into those plants. They'd been living things that he'd nurtured from tiny saplings into a beautiful green wall. Around 2 a.m, David remembered the security cameras he'd installed. With trembling hands, he pulled up the footage from that afternoon on his laptop. The video was even worse than David had imagined. It showed Patricia arriving at 11:47 a.m. with a 3-man landscaping crew. She pointed at the hedge and gestured animatedly while the crew unloaded chainsaws and a wood chipper. The destruction took less than 2 hours, but what made David's blood boil was Patricia's behavior during the process. The camera captured her taking selfies with the destruction in the background. She posed next to the wood chipper like a tourist at a landmark. When the crew was finishing up, she actually applauded. The footage also showed several neighbors coming out to watch the destruction. Mrs. Chen from across the street looked horrified and appeared to be arguing with Patricia at one point. Tom from down the street shook his head and walked away in disgust. Even some people David didn't recognize had stopped their cars to stare at the scene. By morning, David's phone was ringing constantly. Word had spread through the neighborhood about what Patricia had done, and neighbors were calling to express their outrage and support. David, I can't believe she actually did it, Linda from Oak Street said when she called. I mean, we all knew she was power-hungry, but this is vandalism. Mrs. Chen brought him a casserole and a card signed by 6 different neighbors expressing their sympathy and support. That woman has gone too far, she said. We're all talking about getting her removed from office. Even people David barely knew were reaching out. A couple from the other end of the neighborhood stopped by to say they'd witnessed the destruction and would be happy to testify if David decided to take legal action. David called his lawyer, Robert Chen, first thing Friday morning. They actually did it? Robert asked, sounding shocked. They destroyed your hedge? Every plant, David confirmed. And then Patricia gave me a bill for $800 for the removal. David, this is criminal destruction of property. We need to file a police report immediately, and I'm also going to recommend that you sue both Patricia personally and the HOA for damages. How much are we talking about? David asked. Well, replacement cost for mature landscaping like that could easily be $5,000 to $10,000, plus the cost of restoring your property, legal fees, and possibly punitive damages for the malicious nature of the destruction. David felt overwhelmed. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to have a nice yard. I know, Robert said sympathetically, but sometimes standing up to bullies is the only way to stop them from hurting other people. If Patricia gets away with this, who's next? That afternoon, David filed a police report. The officer who took the report seemed genuinely shocked by the security camera footage. Ma'am, the officer said after watching Patricia's celebratory poses, this is clearly malicious destruction of property. We'll be pursuing charges. By Friday evening, word of what had happened to David's hedge had spread beyond Riverside Gardens. Someone had posted about it on social media, and the story was being shared widely. Local news stations started calling, wanting to interview David about the HOA dispute. David wasn't sure he wanted the attention, but Jerry convinced him to talk to the reporters. People need to know what this woman did, Jerry said, and other neighborhoods need to know what can happen when HOAs get out of control. As David stood in his front yard talking to a news reporter, with the bare dirt where his hedge used to be visible in the background, he realized that this story was bigger than just his plants. This was about whether people had the right to enjoy their own property without harassment from petty tyrants. The reporter asked him what he planned to do next. David looked at the empty space where his hedge had been, then back at the camera. I'm going to rebuild, he said. But next time, I'm going to make sure nobody can ever destroy my landscaping again. He had no idea yet what form that rebuilding would take. But he knew one thing for certain. Patricia Hoffman had made the biggest mistake of her life. David spent the entire weekend feeling like he was in a fog. Every time he looked out his front window at the bare patch of dirt where his hedge used to be, he felt a mixture of sadness and rage that made it hard to concentrate on anything else. His neighbors kept stopping by with words of support, but David was struggling to figure out what to do next. Sunday evening, while scrolling through social media posts about his situation, something clicked in David's mind. He wasn't going to let Patricia win. He wasn't going to let her destroy 3 years of his work and just walk away. But he also wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him defeated or broken. David Williams was an engineer, which meant he was a problem solver by nature. And this problem required an engineering solution. Monday morning, David called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. Instead of going to the water treatment plant, he drove to the county planning office with a specific mission in mind. If Patricia wanted to play games with rules and regulations, then David was going to learn every single rule better than she did. I need to understand the difference between landscaping regulations and building codes, David told the planning clerk, a helpful woman named Helen who seemed genuinely interested in his situation. Well, landscaping is typically governed by HOA rules or city ordinances about vegetation, Helen explained. But permanent structures like walls, fences, and buildings fall under entirely different regulations. Building codes, setback requirements, permit processes. The HOA usually has no authority over permanent structures as long as they meet city codes. David felt a spark of excitement. So if I wanted to build a wall where my hedge used to be, the HOA couldn't stop me. Not if you get the proper permits and follow building codes, Helen confirmed. Pros can regulate landscaping, but they can't override municipal building authority. David spent the next 3 hours at the planning office, studying setback requirements, height restrictions, and permit processes. What he learned made him smile for the first time since Thursday evening. According to city building codes, he could build a wall up to 6 feet tall on his property, as long as it was at least 3 feet from the property line. His hedge had been 2 feet from the property line, which meant he had plenty of room to work with. The permit process would take about 2 weeks, and the fee was only $150. That afternoon, David drove to every building supply store in town, pricing materials and talking to contractors. What he had in mind was ambitious, but definitely doable. Tuesday morning, David was back at the planning office filing permit applications. Helen looked over his plans with obvious admiration. "This is really smart," she said. "Your HOA president probably has no idea that she can't regulate permanent structures. I'm hoping to keep it that way until construction is finished," David replied. While waiting for his permits to be approved, David spent the week researching contractors and gathering more evidence for his lawsuit. The security camera footage had been turned over to police, and his lawyer was building a strong case for damages. But David's focus was on the future, not the past. He'd decided that the best revenge against Patricia wasn't just winning in court. It was showing her that her bullying tactics had completely backfired. The permits were approved on Friday afternoon. David immediately called the contractor he'd chosen, a local family business called Rodriguez Construction, that had excellent reviews and competitive prices. "When do you want to start?" asked Carlos Rodriguez, the owner, after reviewing David's plans. "Monday morning," David said without hesitation. "And I want to work as fast as possible," Carlos grinned. "I like your style. My crew can have this done in a week if the weather cooperates." That weekend, David did something he hadn't done since the hedge destruction. He felt genuinely excited about his front yard again. His new project was going to be even better than the hedge. It would provide more privacy, last forever, and best of all, there wasn't a thing Patricia could do to stop it or destroy it. Monday morning arrived gray and cloudy, but David didn't care about the weather. At 7 a.m. sharp, Rodriguez Construction pulled up with a truck full of materials and 4 crew members ready to work. The materials alone were impressive. Concrete blocks, rebar, bags of mortar, and decorative caps that would give the finished wall a professional upscale appearance. David had chosen a light gray color that would complement his house and look attractive from the street. "You sure about the height?" Carlos asked as they marked out the foundation line. 6 feet is pretty tall for a front yard wall." "I'm sure," David replied. "I want maximum privacy, and I want it to be substantial enough that nobody will ever think about trying to remove it." By 9 a.m., the crew was digging the foundation trench. By 10 a.m., neighbors were starting to gather to watch the construction process. Jerry was the first to figure out what David was doing. "You're building a wall?" he asked, his face breaking into a huge grin. "A permanent structure," David corrected. "Fully permitted and built to city code. Patricia can regulate landscaping, but she has no authority over this." Word spread through the neighborhood faster than David had expected. By lunchtime, there was a steady stream of neighbors stopping by to see the construction progress and offer their support. "This is brilliant," said Linda from Oak Street. "She destroys your hedge so you build something she can never touch." Mrs. Chen brought sandwiches for the construction crew and stayed to watch them work. "David, you're a genius," she said. "This wall is going to be beautiful, and that awful woman can't do anything about it." Even people David didn't know well were stopping by. Tom from down the street brought cold drinks for the workers. A couple from 3 blocks away stopped their evening walk to express their admiration for David's solution. "We heard about what happened to your hedge," the woman said. "This is perfect revenge. Legal, permanent, and probably more effective than the hedge ever was." The construction proceeded exactly on schedule. Tuesday, the foundation was poured. Wednesday, the crew started laying blocks. By Thursday afternoon, the wall was already 4 feet high and looking substantial. David made sure to be home every day to watch the progress and answer neighbors' questions. The wall was becoming a neighborhood event with people timing their walks to coincide with construction hours. "How high is it going to be?" asked a neighbor David didn't recognize. 6 feet, David replied. "Same height that's allowed by city code. And the HOA can't make you tear it down?" "Nope, it's a permanent structure built with proper permits. The HOA has no jurisdiction over it." By Friday afternoon, David noticed a familiar car driving slowly past his house multiple times. Patricia had finally discovered what he was doing. Friday evening, just as the construction crew was cleaning up for the week, Patricia marched up David's driveway with her clipboard and her usual stern expression. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing at the half-completed wall. "It's a wall," David replied calmly. "A permanent structure built with proper city permits and in full compliance with building codes." Patricia's face was turning red. "You can't build this without HOA approval." "Actually, I can," David said, pulling out his permit documentation. "The HOA has no authority over permanent structures that comply with municipal building codes. This is completely legal." Patricia stared at the permits like they were written in a foreign language. This is ridiculous. "You're doing this just to spite me." "I'm doing this to protect my property from future destruction," David replied. "Once this wall is finished, nobody will ever be able to destroy my landscaping again." "I'll have you know that I'm going to fight this," Patricia threatened. "The board will not stand for this kind of defiance." "Feel free to check with city planning," David said. "They'll be happy to explain the difference between HOA authority and municipal building codes." Carlos Rodriguez had been listening to this exchange while loading his truck. He walked over with a big smile on his face. "Ma'am, if it makes you feel any better, this is one of the nicest residential walls we've ever built. It's going to add significant value to the neighborhood." Patricia glared at Carlos, then back at David. "This isn't over," she said and stalked away. Jerry, who had been watching the confrontation from his yard, came over to David with tears of laughter in his eyes. "Did you see her face?" Jerry said. "She just realized that she destroyed your hedge for nothing. Now you're building something 10 times better and there's not a thing she can do about it." David looked at his half-completed wall, already impressive and substantial even in its unfinished state. "You know what, Jerry? I think this is going to work out even better than I hoped." By the time Carlos and his crew left that Friday evening, David's wall was the talk of not just Riverside Gardens, but apparently the entire city. Someone had posted construction photos on social media, and the story of the HOA president who destroyed a hedge only to have the homeowner build an impenetrable wall was being shared widely. David's phone was buzzing with messages from friends, co-workers, and even strangers who wanted to express their support for his creative solution. One message in particular made him smile. It was from a landscape architect who had seen the story online. "Your wall design is beautiful and brilliant. Mind if I use this as an example in my next HOA dispute case?" As David settled in for the weekend, he looked out at his wall in progress and felt something he hadn't experienced since before Patricia destroyed his hedge. Genuine excitement about his property. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning brought perfect weather and the sound of construction equipment returning to Maple Street. David had barely finished his coffee when Carlos and his crew arrived, ready to complete what had already become the most talked-about home improvement project in Riverside Gardens history. "Today's the day," Carlos announced cheerfully. "By this evening, you're going to have the finest wall in the county." David could hardly contain his excitement. Over the weekend, he'd received dozens of messages from neighbors and even strangers expressing their support for his project. The story had spread far beyond his neighborhood, with people calling it everything from brilliant to the perfect response to HOA tyranny. The construction crew worked with remarkable efficiency. By noon, the wall had reached its full 6-foot height, and the workers were installing the decorative concrete caps that would give it a finished, professional appearance. The wall was substantial, attractive, and undeniably permanent. Around 1 p.m., David noticed Patricia's car parked across the street. She was sitting behind the wheel, staring at his property with an expression that could only be described as fury, mixed with disbelief. David waved at her cheerfully, but she quickly drove away. "I think your HOA president is having some regrets about destroying your hedge," Carlos observed with a chuckle. "I think you're right," David replied, "but it's too late for regrets now." By 3 p.m., a small crowd of neighbors had gathered to watch the final stages of construction. Mrs. Chen had brought folding chairs and was treating the wall completion like a neighborhood block party. Jerry was giving impromptu tours, explaining to anyone who would listen how David had outsmarted the HOA by understanding the difference between landscaping regulations and building codes. "You see," Jerry told a couple who had driven over from the next neighborhood to see the famous wall, "Patricia thought she could bully David by destroying his hedge. But David's an engineer. He doesn't get mad, he gets smart." At 4:30 p.m., Carlos officially declared the wall complete. It was 6 feet of beautiful solid concrete block construction, professionally built and designed to last for decades. The light gray color complemented David's house perfectly, and the decorative caps gave it an upscale appearance that actually enhanced the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. "This is probably the best residential wall we've ever built," Carlos told David as they walked along its length, inspecting the finished work. "It's going to outlast your house." David ran his hand along the smooth concrete surface and felt a deep satisfaction. This wall represented more than just a property boundary. It was proof that bullies don't always win, and that sometimes the best response to destruction is to build something even better. The celebration was interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming. Patricia had returned, this time accompanied by 2 other people David recognized as fellow HOA board members. "Mr. Williams," Patricia called out in her most official voice as she marched across his lawn, "the board has met in emergency session, and we're ordering you to immediately halt this construction." David smiled calmly. "Construction's already finished, Mrs. Hoffman. And as I explained on Friday, the HOA has no authority over permitted structures that comply with building codes." One of the board members, a nervous-looking man named Frank, stepped forward. "Surely there must be some regulation we can cite." "Feel free to check with the city planning office," David replied. "They'll be happy to explain municipal building authority versus HOA jurisdiction." Patricia was practically shaking with rage. "This is a deliberate act of defiance against the homeowners association." "This is a homeowner exercising his legal rights to improve his property," Jerry interjected. He'd positioned himself squarely between Patricia and David, clearly ready to defend his neighbor. "Nobody asked for your opinion." "Jerry," Patricia snapped. "And nobody asked you to destroy David's hedge," Mrs. Chen called out from her folding chair. "But you did it anyway." David noticed that a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, and they were all clearly on his side. Linda from Oak Street was taking pictures of the confrontation. Tom from down the street was recording video on his phone. Even some teenagers from the neighborhood had stopped to watch the drama unfold. "Mrs. Hoffman," David said calmly, "you destroyed my hedge because you claimed the HOA had authority over landscaping. Now I've built a permanent structure that the HOA has no authority over. The difference is that my wall is completely legal." Patricia looked around at the crowd of neighbors, all of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from disapproval to open hostility. For the first time since David had met her, she seemed to realize that she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Yes, it is," said a voice from the back of the crowd. David turned to see his lawyer, Robert Chen, walking up the driveway with a satisfied smile on his face. "Mrs. Hoffman," Robert continued, "I'm here to serve you with a lawsuit for criminal destruction of property, trespassing, harassment, and violation of my client's civil rights. You might want to contact your insurance company about legal representation." Patricia's face went white as she took the legal documents from Robert. You're suing me? You destroyed thousands of dollars worth of landscaping without authority, and then had the audacity to bill my client for the destruction, Robert replied. What did you think would happen? The crowd of neighbors began murmuring among themselves, clearly pleased that Patricia was finally facing consequences for her actions. The police investigation is also moving forward, Robert continued. Criminal charges are likely to be filed within the next few days. Patricia looked around desperately at her fellow board members. But Frank and the other member had already started backing away from the confrontation. I was acting in my capacity as HOA president, Patricia protested weakly. You were acting as a vandal, Robert replied, and now you're going to face the consequences. After Patricia and the remaining board members retreated, the crowd of neighbors broke into spontaneous applause. David felt overwhelmed by the show of support from his community. Speech, speech, someone called out. And suddenly everyone was encouraging David to say something. David climbed onto one of Mrs. Chen's folding chairs so everyone could see him. I just want to thank everyone for your support through this whole ordeal, he began. When Patricia destroyed my hedge, I was devastated. But all of you showed me that this neighborhood is full of good people who look out for each other. The crowd applauded again, and David continued. This wall represents more than just my property line. It represents the idea that bullies don't get to win just because they have a little bit of power. Sometimes standing up to them makes the whole community stronger. Over the next few weeks, the effects of David's victory rippled through Riverside Gardens and beyond. The story of the wall had gone viral on social media, with thousands of people sharing it as an example of creative problem-solving and standing up to HOA abuse. Local news stations followed up on the story, interviewing David about his experience and the importance of homeowners understanding their rights. The video of Patricia demanding that he tear down his legal wall became a popular meme, shared widely with captions like, "When you don't understand the law but try to enforce it anyway." More importantly, Patricia's reign of terror in Riverside Gardens was coming to an end. Other residents who had been intimidated by her threats began speaking up about their own experiences with her arbitrary enforcement and harassment. A group of neighbors organized a petition to recall Patricia from her position as HOA president. Within 2 weeks, they had gathered enough signatures to force a special election. I never thought I'd get involved in HOA politics, Linda from Oak Street told David, but watching how you handled Patricia showed me that we don't have to put up with that kind of behavior. The recall election was held 6 weeks after David's wall was completed. Patricia lost by a landslide, with over 80% of residents voting to remove her from office. She resigned from the HOA board entirely the next day. The new HOA board, elected on a platform of common sense and fair enforcement, immediately began reviewing and overturning many of Patricia's arbitrary rules and fines. They also implemented new procedures to prevent future abuse of power and ensure that homeowners had proper appeal processes for any violations. David's lawsuit against Patricia was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that more than covered his legal fees and the cost of his wall. Patricia's homeowner's insurance company also required her to attend anger management counseling as a condition of maintaining coverage. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the effect David's story had on other communities. His approach, researching, building codes and constructing a permanent structure that HOAs couldn't regulate, became a widely discussed strategy for homeowners facing similar harassment. David's wall, as it came to be known on social media, inspired dozens of similar projects across the country. Homeowners who had been bullied by overzealous HOAs began building their own walls, installing permanent landscaping features, and generally finding creative ways to protect their property rights. 1 year after Patricia destroyed his hedge, David received a letter from a homeowner in Texas who had built his own wall after being inspired by David's story. "Your wall gave me the courage to stand up to my own HOA bully," the letter read. "Thank you for showing that we don't have to be victims." David's wall had become more than just a property boundary. It had become a symbol of homeowner rights and the power of creative resistance to petty tyranny. On the anniversary of his hedge's destruction, David hosted a neighborhood barbecue in his backyard. Nearly 50 people attended, including several who had moved to Riverside Gardens specifically because they'd heard it was a community that stood up for its residents. As David looked around at his neighbors enjoying themselves in his yard. With his beautiful wall providing the perfect backdrop for the celebration, he reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. He'd lost a hedge but gained something much more valuable: the respect of his community, the satisfaction of standing up to a bully, and the knowledge that sometimes the best response to destruction is to build something even better. The wall stood strong and beautiful, a permanent reminder that with creativity, determination, and a good understanding of building codes, even the most powerful HOA Karen could be defeated. And every morning when David looked out his front window at his magnificent wall, he smiled and thought about the hedge that had started it all. Patricia had destroyed his plants, thinking she was teaching him a lesson about power. Instead, she had taught him something much more valuable: that the best revenge is building something so good, so permanent and so completely legal that your enemies can never tear it down.